Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into the Indian stock market. Specifically, we're taking a look at an article you guys sent over called "The Top 10 Epic Learnings in the Month of October." And to help us break it all down, we've got our expert here with us today.
Oh,
So are you ready to get started?
absolutely I am.
Okay, great. So the first thing that kind of jumped out at me in this article was the whole section on data center cooling. I mean, who knew that keeping servers cool was such a big deal?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy the amount of energy that goes into keeping those things running. And that's why the shift towards liquid cooling is so significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a trend. It's about becoming way more efficient.
Right.
And that's what's driving that 12, 14% annual growth rate
Exactly.
that the article mentioned. So basically what you're saying is that this increased efficiency could actually translate into some potential investment opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if everybody's going to need these solutions, it makes sense to at least be aware of the companies that are providing them.
Right, exactly.
And Vertuve is mentioned in the article as like the global leader. They have a commanding market share. But what's really interesting to me is there's a few Indian companies also making waves in this sector.
Okay. Which ones should we be looking at?
Blue Star, Apar, KRN Heat, and Schneider.
Okay. So those are all names to keep an eye on.
Yeah,
But of course not investment advice, but definitely something to watch.
for sure.
Okay, so moving on, we got this whole story about the cola wars.
Yeah,
Now, I love a good Coke versus Pepsi battle as much as anyone else.
who doesn't?
But I was surprised to see how this price war
Yeah.
is actually impacting other drinks.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
it really shows how interconnected all of these markets are. When Coke and Pepsi slash their prices, suddenly fruit juices and glucose drinks from companies like Dabur and Tata Consumer start looking a lot more expensive
Right.
in comparison to consumers. And there's even snippets from their con calls talking about the impact, the negative impact that it's having.
Wow. So it's like a chain reaction. You wouldn't think that a price war on cola would hit fruit juice sales.
Yeah. You got to think about those second and third order effects, you know?
Right. It's a good reminder to always think beyond the obvious
Mm-hmm.
and consider those ripple effects.
For sure.
Okay, now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about performance. The article mentioned that while the overall P/T growth in the NSE 500 was only about 4%, there were pockets of strength,
Yeah.
particularly among small and mid-cap companies.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it goes against the conventional wisdom that
Yeah.
the large cap companies are always the best performers,
Okay.
you know, but then when you think about it, smaller companies are more agile, they're able to adapt to changing market conditions.
Right, and they often operate in those like niche markets too,
Uh-huh.
which maybe helps shield them a lot.
Precisely. From broader economic headwinds.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to not
Ah.
overlook the smaller players.
Also, the healthcare and diagnostic sector showed strong performance.
Okay, and that was also highlighted. Okay, so let's move on to this next topic, which is the world of pharma. Contract manufacturing. It seems pretty complex, to be honest.
Yeah, it is a little bit, but the article does a good job of breaking it down into three main categories. The first being your innovator CDMOs.
Okay.
So like Divis, partnering with big pharma names like Pfizer or Neuland, who works with BMS.
So is that kind of like a high-risk, high-reward type of...
Exactly
Yeah.
situation
Yeah.
because you're dealing with, you know, cutting-edge drug development.
Right, the margins are typically higher there.
Yeah, for sure. And then you got CDMOs with assets abroad. So companies like Piramal Pharma, Jubilant Pharmova.
Okay, so they're playing on a more global...
Right, they're playing on a global feel,
Yeah.
and they might have lower ROCE compared to those just operating in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they could benefit from things like the Biosecure Act, which aims to strengthen U.S. pharmaceutical supply chains.
Okay. And then finally
Yeah.
got the contract manufacturers for generic drugs like Occam, Innovacap, Winloss.
Okay. And what's the landscape like for them?
So this is the segment that's really dominated by a lot of smaller players, and they're kind of going through a period of consolidation right now.
Really? So what does that look like?
So the larger players are acquiring the smaller ones, or they're being outcompeted because of things like increasing regulatory requirements, capital expenditure needs.
So it's a tough market to be in if you're a smaller player.
Right. And the article did provide some key financial metrics for this segment.
Okay.
So margins around 12-16%, asset turnover 2.5 to 3x, and ROEs between 15 and 20%.
Okay. So not bad. But I can see why that consolidation might be
Or
happening.
the bigger players just have more resources
Right.
to deal with all of it.
Okay, so speaking of changing landscapes, the article talked about some new trade barriers being put in place. Specifically, the Bureau of Indian Standards, or BIS, is imposing these stricter standards on imported AC.
And refrigerator components.
Right, and that's going to primarily impact the Chinese and Vietnamese players,
Okay.
and it could create a vacuum in the market, especially as we head into, the next summer season. So that means a potential opportunity for,
Domestic manufacturing.
exactly, to step in and fill that gap.
Okay, it's a good example how regulatory changes can really reshape
Hmm.
the competitive landscape.
And it's not just limited to ACs and refrigerators. They also mentioned similar BIS standards being imposed on imported steel and cement.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's a trend towards prioritizing domestic production.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's talk about foreign investment for a minute. The article mentioned that foreign ownership of Indian stocks has hit a record low. What's going on there?
So it's most likely tied to the recent sell-offs we've seen, as well as a potential reallocation of funds to the U.S. market following the elections.
So some investors might be getting a little spooked.
It's understandable given the recent slowdown in Indian corporate earnings growth.
Okay.
But the Reserve Bank of India's latest bulletin suggests that we might see a revival in economic growth.
In the second half of the fiscal year.
Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope.
It's something to watch closely for sure.
Yeah. It'll be particularly interesting to see how all that unspent capital expenditure might be deployed
Yeah.
in the coming months and how that impacts corporate earnings.
For sure.
Okay, good to know now. This next trend really caught my eye, the Great Indian Wedding Shift, it seems like. The traditional wedding season has moved almost entirely
Mm-hmm.
to the second half of the fiscal year.
Yeah, it's huge economic and cultural event.
Wow.
We're talking about 48 lakh weddings taking place between November and mid-December.
Wow. That's a lot of weddings.
Yeah. Imagine the spending.
Yeah, I imagine that translates into
Yeah.
a lot of spending.
Absolutely. I mean, this compressed wedding season is expected to inject like 6 lakh crore into the economy, a 25% increase from the previous year, thanks in part to a jump in auspicious dates.
That's a significant boost. So what sectors stand to benefit the most from this?
So pretty much anything, wedding-related,
Groups,
jewelry, hospitality, fashion, all these sectors are going to see a surge in demand.
So venues, catering, decorations, gold, clothing, the list goes on and on.
Right. And the article mentioned 1 lakh weddings will have budgets over 50 lakh each, and 50,000 will be spending over 1 crore.
Wow. Some serious spending power.
That's a mini economic boom,
Yeah.
all centered around weddings.
Yeah, it's definitely something businesses need to be aware of.
If they want to capitalize on that.
Okay, moving on to our next topic. And this one came as a little bit of a surprise. Indian whiskey exports are on the rise.
They are. 26% increase in exports in the first half of 2024.
Oh,
And what's even more interesting is the diversification
Yeah.
of the export markets.
Okay, so we're not just talking about
Yeah.
like the traditional markets anymore.
Okay. UAE, Netherlands, Ghana.
Okay, they're all big importers of Indian whiskey now.
But we're even seeing increased interest from the U.S.
Wait, really? The U.S. is a massive whiskey market.
Yeah, U.S. imports of Indian whiskey have gone up by over 63%, reaching $3.04 million.
Wow, so Indian whiskey is starting to make a name for itself globally.
It is. Brands like Dana, Indri, Rampur, Amrut, and Paul.
Okay,
Yeah.
they're getting recognized for their
Yeah.
quality and their unique flavor profile.
Yeah, and they're not trying to. Just copy Scotch or bourbon.
Right.
They're doing their own thing. And it's resonating with people.
The article pointed out that
Okay.
this industry still has a relatively small base, which implies significant potential for future growth.
Exactly. This is a trend worth keeping an eye on.
Okay, so now let's shift gears to a less glamorous, but equally important sector, power, the article highlighted. The growing trend of reconductoring.
Yeah, you're familiar with that?
Reconductor, I'm not familiar with that. What exactly does that mean?
It's a pretty simple concept. It's basically upgrading the conductors
Yeah.
on existing transmission towers to increase capacity.
So instead of building brand new towers, they're giving the old ones a power boost.
Exactly.
Okay, and it's more cost effective.
Much more than building new towers from scratch.
Yeah.
And it's faster to implement.
Okay, so how much faster?
Think about this in India. It takes about 4 years to get all the approvals and actually install new transmission towers. But in the U.S. and Europe, it can take up to 10 years.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So reconductoring is a smart move. for a lot of reasons.
It saves time and money, which is why it's gaining traction globally.
Right.
Governments and utility companies are always looking for ways to improve their power infrastructure more efficiently. And this seems to be a key part of that.
It makes you wonder why it took so long to catch on.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our final learning from the article, let's talk about investment strategy. This is more about a mindset than a specific trend. It's about the importance of thinking in probabilities.
Right. And this is where that interview with Stanley Druckenmiller comes in.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Yeah.
He's known for his incredible track record.
Yeah, legendary investor. And he believes that in the world of investing, nothing is ever certain.
Yeah. That makes sense because the market
Yeah.
is constantly changing. There are so many factors at play, you can't predict the future.
You can't with 100% certainty.
Okay, so instead of trying to find like the one right answer, it's more about understanding the range of possible outcomes and being prepared to adapt as new information comes in.
That's it. It's about constantly assessing the probabilities, weighing the evidence, making decisions based on the best information available at the time, and being open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Right.
Nobody gets it right 100% of the time. The key is to learn from your mistakes, adjust your approach, and keep moving forward.
So it's about being humble, acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, and being willing to learn and adapt as you go.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about having that flexible mindset, being willing to question your assumptions, and always be learning.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from data center cooling to whiskey exports, trade barriers, to the great Indian wedding shift.
As we continue this deep dive, we're going to see that the Indian market is full of surprises, constantly evolving, never dull.
Yeah, it definitely keeps you
Having your toes, that's for sure. But that's also what makes it so exciting.
Okay, so why don't we take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more from Marcia May, our deep dive into the top 10 epic learnings in the month of October.
Okay, so let's jump back into this deep dive with a closer look at the Indian stock market.
Okay.
There's still plenty to uncover in that top 10 epic learnings article you shared.
You're right. There is a lot to discuss. Okay, so where do we go from here?
Let's talk about something that you might not have expected to see in a finance article. Whiskey.
Okay, what about it?
Indian whiskey exports are on the rise, and it's not just a small bump.
Yeah, I did see that. That 26% increase in the first half of 2024 is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting to me is that it's not just going to the usual markets.
Right.
We're seeing a real diversification of export destinations.
So, like, where are these Indian whiskeys going?
UAE, Netherlands, Ghana.
Okay.
They're all big importers of Indian whiskey now.
Wow, now. We're even seeing increased interest from the U.S. Wait, really? The U.S. is a huge whiskey market.
Yeah. You bet. U.S. imports of Indian whiskey have actually gone up by over 63%, reaching $3.04 million.
That's fascinating.
So it may not sound like much compared to overall imports, but it shows a growing interest.
What's the driving this interest? Is it just novelty, or is there something more to it?
Indian whiskey brands. Indri, Rampur, Amrut, and Paljan.
Okay.
They're starting to get noticed for their quality and unique flavor profiles. And they're not trying to just copy Scotch or bourbon. They're doing their own thing, and it's resonating with people.
That's great. And like you said, the article also mentioned that this industry still has a relatively small base. So that implies that there's significant potential for future growth.
Exactly. If this trend continues, we could be looking at a major player on the global whiskey scene in a few years.
Okay, so from a smooth glass of whiskey to something a little less glamorous but equally important, the power sector. The article talked about this thing called reconductoring. What exactly is that?
It's a pretty simple concept, actually. It's all about upgrading the conductors on existing transmission towers to increase their capacity.
So instead of building brand new towers, they're basically giving the old ones a power boost.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's a lot more cost-effective than building new towers from scratch, and it's also a lot faster to implement.
Also faster we talking.
Well, think about this. In India, it takes around 4 years on average to get all the approvals and actually install new transmission towers. But in the U.S. and Europe, it can take up to 10 years.
Wow. That's a huge difference.
So reconductoring really is a smart move for a lot of reasons.
Right.
It saves time and money, which is why it's gaining traction globally.
Okay.
Governments and utility companies are always looking for ways to improve their power infrastructure more efficiently. And reconductoring seems to be a key part of that strategy.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why it took so long to catch on.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's move on to our final takeaway from the article. And this one is more about a mindset than a specific trend. It's about the importance of thinking in probabilities.
And this is where that interview with Stanley Druckenmiller comes in.
Okay.
He's a legendary investor.
I've heard of him, yeah. He's known for his incredible track record.
Yeah, and one of his cool beliefs is that in the world of investing, nothing is ever certain.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. The market's constantly changing. There's so many factors at play. You can't predict the future with 100% certainty.
You can't.
Right.
So he emphasizes the importance of embracing uncertainty,
Yeah.
being comfortable not knowing everything.
So instead of trying to find the one right answer, it's more about understanding the range of possible outcomes and being prepared to adapt as new information comes in.
That's it. It's about constantly assessing the probabilities, weighing the evidence, making decisions based on the best information available at the time, and being open to the possibility that you might be wrong. Nobody gets it right all the time. The key is to learn from your mistakes, adjust your approach, and keep moving forward.
So in a way, it's about being humble, acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, and being willing to learn and adapt as you go.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about having that flexible mindset, a willingness to question your assumptions, and a constant thirst for knowledge.
And speaking of knowledge, a deep dive has certainly given us plenty to think about. What do you say we recap some of the key points?
Sounds good. Before we wrap things up.
All right, so let's recap a little bit what we learned from this deep dive into the Indian stock market. We started with that surprising fact about data centers and how much energy they use for cooling,
Right.
which led us to this whole trend of liquid cooling.
Yeah.
Did you even know?
Honestly, I hadn't given it much thought until I read this article, but it makes sense when you consider how much data we're generating these days and how important it is to keep those servers running smoothly.
Yeah, and the fact that this trend is translating into some pretty interesting investment opportunities, definitely something to keep in mind.
For sure.
And we talked about the cola wars and how this seemingly isolated price war is actually impacting other drink categories.
Yeah, it's like a textbook case of those second and third order effects that we discussed,
Yeah, you got to think beyond the obvious. Consider how events in one market can impact other markets.
Precisely.
And then we moved on to performance. And the fact that small and mid-cap companies are showing some strength, despite that overall slowdown.
Yeah, which just goes to show you that you can't count those smaller players out.
That's a good reminder.
They often have the agility and flexibility to adapt to changing conditions much faster than those big companies.
Yeah, and then we dove into the complex world of pharma contract manufacturing, breaking it down into those three main categories.
Yeah.
Innovators, CDMOs with assets abroad, and contract manufacturers for generics.
That's a fascinating sector.
Yeah, it's one that I'm going to read more about.
Yeah,
It's worth exploring.
especially with all the consolidation happening in the generic segment.
For sure.
And speaking of shifting landscapes, we talked about those new trade barriers
Great.
being imposed on imported AC and refrigerator components, which could create some opportunities for domestic manufacturing.
We'll have to see how it plays out over the coming months.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, we're talking about the record low foreign ownership of Indian stocks, which, kind of suggests that some investors might be getting a little nervous.
Yeah, a little bit. But as we mentioned, there are reasons to be optimistic as well.
Right.
I mean, the Reserve Bank of India is suggesting a potential revival in economic growth.
In the second half of the year.
Right. So definitely mixed bag, but a lot to watch.
For sure.
And of course, who can forget the great Indian wedding shift?
That's right.
48 lakh weddings in just a couple of months. Is a pretty big deal.
It's a huge cultural and economic event. It impacts everything, from jewelry and hospitality to fashion and catering. It's a trend businesses really need to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we had that unexpected trend of Indian whiskey exports on the rise, even making their way into the U.S. market.
I'm really curious to try some of these Indian whiskeys.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And finally, we discussed the importance of thinking in probabilities, which is a key takeaway from that Stanley Druckenmiller interview.
Right. In the world of investing, nothing is certain. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty, with the possibility of being wrong.
It's about being flexible, being willing to adapt, and always being open to learning.
I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree. So there you have it, folks, a deep dive into the Indian stock market based on the article, Top 10 Epic Learnings. in the month of October. Hopefully you guys found this insightful, and maybe it even sparked some new ideas or areas you want to explore further.
As always, the key is to stay informed, be curious, and keep learning.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive at Deep Dive.